Alrighty, so listen, thank you very much. It's hard not having an audience right in front of you, but here we go. So as I said, I've talked about what Remley has done and a little bit about me. But what we wanted to talk about is what I said, not to bury the headline, is that it really takes great clinicians to do great research, and you need both. And as a result, you'll see that no one was a stronger advocate of evidence-based medicine, meaning bringing clinical trials to our specialty areas, not only emergency medicine, but pre-hospital care and also in critical care. But also, that what I've learned over the years is that we need experience-based medicine too. So I think that's the big message. And we're going to give you some reasons why we think that's the case here, okay, with that. So a lot of this, I think, and I hope, will be deja vu all over again for you, but we'll still make some teaching points. And, Tom Aufderheide, who I respect more than anybody else in our world, he has the most integrity of anybody I know as a researcher, and he's been a leader. He's been a PI for the Rock, PI, a hub PI for the Siren research, and he's just the most respected guy. And I've just loved working with him over the years. And we actually wrote this 5 or 6 years ago, but we thought it'd be a really good thing to bring up at this point in time for various reasons as I move through this today. Okay. So again, I think we'll still make there'll be, as much as this is deja vu all over again, I hope that there'll be some new information here for you as well. And maybe also give you a glimpse into the future of resuscitation medicine from our point of view. I hope that's the case. And I think we have enough evidence now to start saying there is a true signal here that's going to make a big difference as we get through this. So, of course, there's 4 inevitabilities of life, right? There's death, taxes, what else, right? Well, in California, there's kale. And then, of course, there's disclosures when you do things like this. I'm going to be talking a lot about certain devices. And I can tell you, I have absolutely no conflict of interest whatsoever, except for the fact that I am not a morning person. That's the only thing I have to disclose, okay? And so I want to thank you for doing this in the afternoon, Greg. Appreciate it, okay? And also, some people in my household consider me non-essential nowadays, right? Although I do take out garbage and so on. Remley, do you have anything to disclose?
Unfortunately, I do not.
What do you mean, unfortunately? Oh,
looking for financial discllosures.
That's right. Good point. Well, anyway, I'll tell you, Remley has not got to see these slides, so I'm about to basically embarrass her. But the things I will disclose about her is that, again, she has been, a multiple award winner for various things, especially during the COVID area, et cetera. But she's been a great partner with us. But what I think I want to disclose about her is what I really have come to appreciate is she's what I call an MDT classico. She's a multi-dimensional thinker. That becomes important to what we're going to say here today, because we're going to talk about people who think very binary, something's good or bad, basically will often miss out on what we're going to talk about here today. So thank you for being an MDT, Remley. Okay, sorry if I embarrassed you, but there you go. So before we begin, I want to do one quick anecdote, okay? And that is about a study I did about 20 years ago, maybe more. When we first started bringing AEDs on, okay? Does anybody remember when they first saw an AED, in the airport, for example? Because that was the first public area we hit. It's a long story why I chose that, but that's where we went first. Does everybody remember the first one that they saw? How long? Because everybody takes it for granted now, don't you? Right?
They're pretty ubiquitous these days, which is awesome, actually.
Well, let me tell you, I was training the Surgeon General of the United States at the time, and he said, we got to get these out there. So the GAO decided that, well, is there proof for these things? And we're going, well, and so what we decided to do was just put them out in a public area, and so on. And so we said, well, where do most cardiac arrests occur? Well, most of them occur in homes, or maybe, but if you took one public place where more people are moving through, it's not a hotel or a restaurant, it's the airport. 80 million people were moving through O'Hare that year, and we decided that's the place where we would start. We got so much flack from the FDA. I actually wrote a paper called the FDA, it was called Confrontation Without Comprehension. And we were very fortunate to have friends in the media to help us get this through, but it was not an easy thing, because they said, we can't get permission from people who are the patients. And we go, yeah, they dropped dead. And I think most of them wouldn't care, but we really get it through. So let me just fast forward to my point that I want to make here. So we put these out here the first year. You know how many people had survived from And it would be great to have some interaction from people so I could hear, that you're hearing me. But how many people had survived at the airports in Chicago for the 3 decades before this when we put them in? Let's say from 1970, because we had paramedics around from 70 to say the year 2000, because we put these in around 98, 99 is when I think we did the first data. Anybody have an idea? Well, the answer is nobody. There was a couple anecdotes here, but they were under different circumstances. But despite the fact they had paramedics on campus, there weren't any survivors. We put these in, and the first year there were 12 people who went down. One was just in one of these trains that was going around for a circle. He was just out there and found, I think, in Rigor. And then we had somebody out in the the immigration area. We later got those out, but we originally started the ticket counter and gate areas where we put these, and we made it so that you had about a 30 to 45 minute brisk walk where you're away from an AED. So we had 9 people that went down that ticket counter and gate areas. Okay, you know how many of those people survived that first year? Anybody have any guesses out of 9? Any guesses?
All of them?
Well, let me bias your answer with the fact that in six of the cases, the people had never seen one before. They heard about them, and someone else got and fetched it, and they used it. Okay, so what do you think now?
I'm still optimistic. I'm going to say all of them survived.
Well, the answer is you're right. All 9 survived. Now, 3 decades and no survivors, and almost every one of those guys was waking up before traditional paramedics arrived. Okay, so that's interesting. This is not a controlled clinical trial, is it? Right? And it's not a and the end, right? Well, it was a 2-year study, so we actually had an end eventually of about 20 patients, right? So you'll see where I'm going with all this, right? But you feel comfortable having AEDs out there now, just based on what I just told you? So you'll see where we're going. So as I say here, just keep that one in mind as we move through this, okay? So let's begin with the following statement. I'm going to turn it over to Kremley, but before I go, anybody have anything to say, or are we doing okay so far? Can you hear me okay?
So good.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, good, because I can't really see anybody here. I turned all my whatever's off. So, all right, so with that, Remley, you want to take it away?
Yeah, so I think we're all on the same page here when it comes to EBM, and that is that evidence-based medicine is something that's clearly essential. It can be cost-effective, and it can even be life-saving. And in fact, when we talk about EBM, the gold standard, well, what is the gold standard? Randomized control trials, right? So we've always considered these the gold standard. And in fact, I feel lucky to be here next to Dr. Pepe, as he's been a long proponent, and not only proponent of RCTs, but he actually conducted the first RCTs in EMS. And so I'm actually going to turn it back to you. So could you tell us a little bit more about this experience?
Yeah, and well, one example early on that really I think got known in the trauma and EM literature was we had done some really cool clinical trials back in Seattle, and especially even in the ICU, that were things where I was challenging some sacred cows. And what was interesting is that at this time, ATLS required 2 things. If you had any signs of shock or your blood pressure less than 80, they required that you put on the anti-shock garments. PSG is pneumatic anti-shock garments, sometimes called MAST. And also the issue of IV fluids. And they look like this. It's a big blood pressure cuff thing you'd wrap around the body, and it did great stuff. It, it raised your blood pressure and everything. And you didn't even need a paramedic for it. You could put it on, and if you're a basic EMT, and hopefully get there and make all the difference. Since it was required by law or regulation in 2/3 of the states, we were saying, well, does this thing work? Because when I went and reviewed the literature, there hadn't been anything to say anything except that raised blood pressure, and it didn't, they presume it was a good thing. So there's a lot of empirically intuitive based stuff based on conventional wisdom, and it sounded like a good thing. You raise blood pressure and they do better, and the veins were popping up better. There was all sorts of stuff they said, but no one had done a clinical trial. And I'd come out of Seattle where we had done a lot of clinical trials and showed that some things that were supposed to be working well didn't really work well. So we went ahead and did this. So here's what we found. The anti-shock garment, despite the fact that it was required by regulation, like I said, in 2/3 of the state, actually had worse outcomes. So I beat myself up over this, like how come I had worse outcomes? It'd either be no difference or it'd improve the outcomes. And so anyways, going back, I thought maybe I screwed up maybe I did something wrong in terms of, I don't know, the methodology, but these were like bell curves of age, bell curves of injury severity score. I mean, right down to the organ involved. We even looked at that, 27 spleens and 28 spleens or whatever. It just was the group. In fact, later, it was the Cochrane group said, this is a really great way to do something that you can't blind, because you can't blind these things. So we did it on an every other day basis over about 3 years, but we had so many numbers that the groups were really well matched. So I'm sitting there knocking my head. The only two differences were they had slightly worse outcomes. And the other thing is that they actually raised the blood pressure. Well, that led to me starting to think about something else that I'll come back and talk about, like, how do we come up with the thing about IV fluids being not so good for you? And it all comes kind of back to starting here. But the bottom line is that, interestingly enough, when we did the study, the anti-shock garment group had, like, the patients that we were going to enter into this group when we did the a priori alpha value issue, we had a 50% survival rates for the entry criteria. When we were finished with the study, the anti-shock garment group had 65% survival rate, 65%. So they improved. If you had done just the historical control, you would have said, wow, that's the cat's pajamas. We improved survival by 30%, from 50% to 65%. Well, it turns out we had a control group, and the control group had a 78% survival rate. So the control group did much better. But either way, just by being entered in the trial, you did a lot better. And that's because of all the reasons we all understand. We're doing extra training, we're doing the study effect, et cetera. All right. So any event, what else can you say about that? What do you reflect about that, Remley? So I'll leave it with you.
So I actually think I want to emphasize the point that you just made, and that is that the control group actually had better outcomes than the pass group. And we see this sometimes in trials, that just the fact that you're in a trial, that they're paying special attention to all the things that happen around that. We hear phrases like the Hawthorne effect, that this can play a major role. And so that can make us put some special, I would say, cynicism when we're talking about historical controls. And so this is something just for us to keep in mind when we're talking about a really controlled, tight environment like we're doing when we're in RCT. Not to say that they're not useful, but
yeah. And I'm going to set this up as, I'm just trying to explain, here's my mindset for 3 decades. Okay. So you get where I'm going here, right? So that's it.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So anyways, as Relmy said early on, evidence-based medicine is clearly essential, cost-effective, and even life-saving, because if you think all these people that could have been getting anti-shock garments or IV fluids over the years that probably shouldn't have been getting it, especially high volumes of it early on, it really is an important thing to keep in mind. So, but there's a problem when it comes to cardiac arrest, right? Remley, what do you think?
Oh, what is the problem with cardiac arrest research? Well, in the past 4 decades, any of you who have been following some of these studies and big RCTs have probably been pretty disappointed in the results. I know I was.
And the thing is, we spent millions of dollars and hundreds of hours of person hours, trying to put these trials on, and yet they had really disappointing results. And I remember, because we did the first one back in 1984, 85, we were conducting it. And it just to come this far and see the disappointments. There's been a couple that have been useful, but overall, it's almost like we wasted money. And then what happens is you saw dissipation of the Resuscitation Outcomes Consortium. So why are the clinical trials, so compromised, et cetera? Well, it's clear that there are many interwoven, interdependent variables. What I mean, ventilation can affect the flow, right? Because if you have overzealous ventilation, knocks out cardiac output because you're having increased intrathoracic pressure at a low flow state. Ventilatory techniques affect blood flow, as I said, but the CPR quality also is affected by numerous factors. Not only the fact that if you go too fast or too slow, and all the other things that we can talk about, and if you're not doing it, it can affect things. So drugs or devices, if you give them too late, they're not going to work, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more later. And the other thing is the interventions that may be good at one point in time, they may not be needed at another point in time. Or if you do it later, they may be harmful. Or if you don't do quality CPR, they may be harmful. So, and the problem is then we see an average of all those. What if it's true, looking back on the anti-shock garments, that there were subcategories of patients that might have been helped by that, whereas the others were much worse off, and I just got an average of those. And we'll see some examples of that as we go through this. So individual device or intervention effectiveness requires a lot of other coordinated interventions. So like I said, you could be doing perfect CPR, but if you're overzealously ventilating it, it won't work. You could be using some great new device, but if the CPR quality sucks, then it ain't gonna work, okay? And I could go through some anecdotes of where I've learned now in the past where that was a real problem, but we'll just go on for this. But you want to give them a classic example of where we're going with this as a good example of this, Remley?
Yeah, absolutely. So in out-of-hospital cardiac arrest research, this was considered a pivotal study. So this is an ITD study. And it's worth mentioning up front that this included 150 EMS agencies who were in the ROC, the Resuscitation's Outcome Consortium. And so just to get into this group, you had to meet a bar of quality CPR. So these are good agencies. And then the study design, something worth highlighting here is that it's what we call an elegant study design, meaning that every patient got an ITD. Now, half of those ITDs were shams and half of them were real, but the providers had no idea which ones were which. And so everything was conducted just as it should be, really great conditions, really great CPR happening probably, but what were the outcomes?
So before I go into that, the impedance threshold device, if you know what it is or not, you put it on the airway, and it actually is I'd have to sort of do a demonstration, but just be that it may, that as you do a compression, as you release during the recoil phase, it's a valve that doesn't quickly let air in to neutralize the pressure. It actually keeps you in a sort of an intrathoracic pressure negative state before the recoil occurs. And as the recoil occurs, it creates more of a vacuum. So you actually shuttle in a little bit more blood. It works fantastically in the laboratory, but like so many other things that we've studied, they didn't work well out in the streets here under these circumstances. Now, this is what we call the gold standard. Elegant study design, NIH funded, New England Journal of Medicine, etc. But what was the outcome you said you wanted to know? What is it?
I'll sum it up with 3 letters, NSD, no significant difference. So another disappointing result.
So does that mean that the ITD does not work altogether and it's not good, okay? And we shouldn't spend our money on it, right? That's the thing. Well, the truth is really pure and never simple as far as I'm concerned, as Oscar Wilde once said, or I guess maybe up my line, like Dirty Harry saying, man's got to know his limitations, right? So it turns out that other studies were done, for example, at the Lancet, in the same year as that was done, there was another study that came out in the Lancet where the active compression decompression device was added in with the ITD. What's that? Well, it's like a toilet plunger device. In fact, that's where they got the idea from, where a plumber's son actually saved his father's life by using the plunger device on him. And there was a real good reason for it. As you can see here, I actually took this video in Paris, 1999. And what you do is you're doing compressions and then decompression. So what that does, and it brings in more blood into the chest. Again, in the laboratory, this is well demonstrated. And the thing of it is, when you combine the two, they're really very helpful. This study was one of the few studies that actually showed an impressive outcome in a clinical trial published in the Lancet. And they showed at 1 year, the survival rates were up 50% in terms of neurologically improved outcomes long-term. And for those of you who want to know what that was, CPC 1 or 2, or MRS, what do you call it? Rankin, modified Rankin scale score of 3 or less. So any event, and again, here's Tom Alterheide, as far as I'm concerned, the man when it comes down to research and research integrity. So how do you explain the discrepancy here? Why is that? Why did the one study show the ITD didn't? So there's several explanations. Maybe one, the ITD doesn't do anything, and so it's just a passive device. It was all being done by that plunger device, right? Secondly, what is it? Maybe it needs the plunger device to work. And I will just sort of quickly tell you, as in the laboratory where I've actually done those studies, what we find is that it does give increment to each other. They are actually work together better when they are together, okay? So we knew in the laboratory they both help, especially in porcine models, large porcine models. And so it just made sense. But so why the discrepancy? Why didn't we get good outcomes with one and the other? So Remley, what do you think? What else could it be?
Well, what else happens when we take things out into the real world? The first thing I want to know is, what was the quality of CPR like?
And that's an excellent point. And I would also say, what's the quality of, like, say, the ventilation, like if you're doing overzealous ventilation. So for example, as Tom will tell you, in Milwaukee, when he did studies several years ago, they were given breaths at 36 per minute when he was first measuring it. And even when he trained them and brought them back to say, keep it down to 12 breaths per minute, which in itself was probably too fast as well. But then they did better, but they were still at like 20 to 25 breaths per minute that they were given out there. So it could be some other effect modifiers. So you may not get any of these things to work under those circumstances. So we actually looked at when you asked the question, is it quality of CPR? We went back and looked at that ITD study that you were quoting before. That was our elegant study. And these guys, if you don't know them, these are like the top researchers in all these areas here, except Remley Crowe. She was not in there, I guess, right? So, but anyways, this is before we started interfacing with her, so to speak. And so what's kind of cool about this is what we found was very, very interesting. And I'm going to show you, I think it's a fun thing for all you to use in the future, which is contour plotting. So contour plotting is kind of like your weather map, right? And so I learned this from the statisticians that we work with here. And if you're looking in here, here's the sham ITD, meaning it was the ITD that was inactivated. We had, they were all coded, so we know which ones they were. Here's your compression rate of 100, 120. So you can see the green area, which I'm going to identify as a good area, is between 100 and 120. And that's where you get your current thing where people tell you to go 100 to 120, right? If you look out here, this is blue, so that's cold, right? So this is like 0 survival rates, right? It goes up it's a little better here, 2%, 3% neurologically intact. Then you're getting better if you're up in these green zones. So you're like 6% moving up towards in the, maybe the yellow 7% neurologically intact. So this is our so-called thing that you guys have heard about for the last 10 years called the sweeter spot for neurologically sound survival. And it's right here with a depth of about something like 3.5 to 4.5 centimeters, et cetera, 5 here. So that's about 2.5 inches around here right in the center. So you aim for that, and you aim for 110, you're probably doing pretty good. Now, ready for this? Here's the subgroup. And by the way, we collected the data. The data were recorded on all these patients. Remember, Renly said to get into this, you had to demonstrate you're doing good CPR, et cetera. But obviously, some people weren't getting good CPR in these cases, but we had records of this. But if you were in the sweet spot, you had a good outcome. Well, okay, look at this. When you put the ITD on, you're like almost doubling the survival rates or more if you're in this, what I call the sweeter spot for neurologically sound outcome. And again, what's even more interesting, there's more of a blue area. So if we get out into the blue areas and there's more blue, it might mean if you're not doing quality CPR, you're actually hurting people with this thing on, okay? But the advantages that you get here is dramatic if you're in the sweeter spot. So if you control it. So part of I think the resolution was not that the ITD was good or bad. It could actually be bad, possibly. I can't prove that to you, but it definitely was better for you if you were in that sweeter spot here and you did the CPR correctly, okay, under those circumstances. So we've now developed mechanisms in which we can actually deliver the rate and depth correctly, et cetera, with machines and so on, and that helps out quite a bit. So we published this in JAMA Cardiology a couple of years ago, but let me critique my own paper in the sense that what if I change a parameter here, like I overzealously ventilate the patient? Or what if I change the parameters by having something on that creates better flow? Maybe these numbers will go down or change. Maybe the rate should be at 100, whatever it might be. It all kind of depends. So keep in mind that it all depends upon the circumstances. Like the ITD can work, but it depends on the circumstances, okay? So Remley, what's your summary for all this?
The bottom line for me is what you just said a couple slides ago, and that's that an intervention isn't simply good or bad. And so, what kind of an example do we have for this one?
Well, one of the things that it comes to mind right away, and I think I was expecting some of my trauma friends to be on the call today, but if not, here it is. If you take something like TXA out in the field for bleeding deaths, and I'm not going to get into the controversy about the methodologies and numbers and all that stuff, but I'm just going to take it just for fun. And I think this is actually true to some extent, is that if you took it at face value, that it said, oh, the outcomes were better over here, right? If you're looking at your relative rate, your relative odds ratios and all that kind of thing, right? But this is really driven, this number here, which is an overall average, it's driven by, sorry about that. Let's see. It's driven by the fact that if you got it on board within an hour, you did really well. But that also suggests to me, like I was suggesting to you on the ITD, that if you wait, let's say out here, 2 or 3 hours more, the later you give it, then it's actually harmful. So this is really an average of something that could harm you if you give it late. And there's reasons why, and I've written papers about that and so on. And there's, but maybe you are good. So in some of the studies we've done recently, we found out if we get this thing on board within the first 45 minutes in appropriate groups, you actually will do very well. But if you wait till later, it's not so good. So anyways, I think I'm just trying, we can argue about the TXA studies and all that, but I think I want to make a point is that you need to be thinking this way, multidimensionally, time-wise, or whatever else it might be. Remley, can you give us some other examples about that? These are just some examples that we have that reported studies that are, they're evidence-based medicine, right? New England Journal of Medicine, NIH study, doesn't make any difference, okay, under those terms. So most are always thinking binary, simply good or bad, right? But it really depends, correct? Can you give us, well, I like this, so I gotta play this one.
With me. Then you're my enemy.
If you're not with me, you're my enemy. Things are so contentious.
Only a Sith deals in absolutes.
But Obi-Wan's smarter than us and says, oh, only a Sith deals in absolutes, right? Oh, that kind of thing. And so again, Tom and I have written on both this, and why we said we need both evidence-based medicine and experience-based method, because we saw in the laboratory this thing worked well. Why didn't it work? Well, we controlled for ventilation, we controlled for CPR, and a multitude of other factors that are in there. And did it work for shockable rhythms? Did it work for non-shockable rhythms? Whatever it might be, those are the things that need to be looked at under those circumstances. And can you how about give us an example with the AED thing that I talked about, because that we talked about before, Remley?
Right. I mean, well, what if we're considering? Yeah, I mean, what if we're considering getting these AEDs for public places, right? And what if I come back with a trial and I say, hey, you know what? I got this thing on 5 minutes before the standard. And it comes back with, you know what? There's no difference in survival. Nobody survived. Well, should we just not buy AEDs then? What other points should we consider? I mean, what if the intervention was applied at minute 17? And, well, it's been applied at minute 25, but I got it on at minute 17. We still wouldn't really likely see any differences there. So that doesn't necessarily mean that this thing is worthless, right? And another good example, what about epinephrine? What about the epinephrine studies in pre-hospital care?
Like the paramedic study where they didn't get it out for like whatever, 20 minutes or something like that. So whatever. But we have other examples where things work good. But the bottom line I think I take away here is that I've learned that research has to be spelt wrong. It's been spelt wrong. It should be research. And we need to be thinking continuously and not say, okay, this is the definitive answer, especially if it just doesn't feel right. And it just didn't feel right for a lot of us. And that really is a concept. I hope I get back to all of you. It's just integral to excellence in research. It may be painful because you got to do things over again, but here we go. So in conclusion, what we call evidence-based medicine is not always the ultimate truth, okay? It may be accurate. And that study, for example, the ITD is accurate. If you don't care about quality CPR, or you're not controlling for ventilation, then that's exactly what you're going to get under those circumstances. But if you can adjust those things accordingly, you can maybe make a good thing out of it. So now I want to sort of give you a quick glance into the future, and hopefully then I can have this wrapped up in the next 5 minutes or so. But I'm just laying out the thesis of why we're just being, again, agent provocateur, just trying to be provocative and be thinking that maybe be careful about accepting everything you see and hear out there, all that. So I want to ask you, which way do we go? Remley, you know better than anybody else, because a lot of this comes down to the statistical realm, I think, right?
Yeah, when it comes to advancing science and saving money and all of this frustration that we had, well, what are some alternatives? What can we do differently instead of RCTs if they aren't working for our cardiac arrest research?
Well, one of the things that comes to mind is that, the AED, we were able to do that. And you saw historically, it was just dramatic, and so, well, that's fine. That was a signal then. So can we reproduce that in some other area as well? Okay, if we say, okay, we'll put them at the airport over here. We've had no survivors over here in New York. Let's see what happens now. And maybe we find out in New York that they didn't make any difference, but then again, the way they were placed, maybe they didn't get them on quick enough or whatever it might be. But if you could reproduce the experiment, and that comes back to my professors, I taught about that. When I did work in the laboratory, I remember one time calling one of my really sage professors up and saying, we did it, this thing works, this thing, the oxygen consumption to, whatever, to CO2 production and relating to cardiac output. We did it. We actually measured with mass spectrometers, all this stuff. It was so cool. And we had these great answers. And I was calling up my professor to say, success, we did it. It works. We got the answer. And we found the inflection point. And he sort of just quietly and wisely and with a nice Cheshire Cat smile, just shook his head and said, "It's not successful yet." And I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "It's successful when you can write up these methods properly, just like you did it. They're totally reproducible. And then you send it to another lab, and that lab can reproduce exactly the same results. And if they don't, you got to find out why. You're not successful yet." So the concept of being able to reproduce the experiment is another alternative that we can also think about. Reproducible methodologies with reproducible results, okay? So may not be the purest way of thinking, but when it comes to cardiac arrest, it's just too difficult to do that sometimes to get control over things. So we actually started doing that. We looked at 10 cities that were reproducing results from a way we call what we call the optimal bundle of management of cardiac arrest, which put in a whole bunch of different interventions at the same time. We looked at best practices, and we literally controlled for those things, whether it was the ventilation rate, the way you apply the ITD or active compression decompression device, or all those things. And a bunch of people came out, and this ended up getting at SCCM a couple of years ago, the Star Research Achievement Award. This is becoming a theme. And there's some of the top researchers from around the world actually that were involved with this. Now, we still had to put this to work. And one of the first places we did it was in pediatric cardiac arrest management. No survivors for years in this particular setting that you're going to see here. And other places where I've worked where out of hospital cardiac arrest, most of these kids are asystolic by the time we get to them because they had a respiratory problem or septic or whatever. And then they basically went into a thing where they got totally anoxic, and now they're way behind the curve. It's not like an oxygenated VF patient who's oxygenated for the next few minutes or so. They're way behind the curve. But what we did was, what have we been doing wrong? Well, everybody thinks it's respiratory, so they overzealously ventilate the kids and knock out their cardiac output. Or they give them little puffy breaths and they don't expand the lungs enough to get blood through it, especially if you're doing pretty good CPR on these kids. So we started to say, okay, we'll give a good lung inflation. We'll control the rate, maybe 1 every 10 seconds. Make sure the lung is inflating, that the chest wall is moving up. And then also, let's get the drugs on board right away. Don't scoop and run, because that's what is happening. People were scooping and running with these kids because they were difficult, they were tough. And we said, just go right to IO, get the drug on board, et cetera. And anyways, I can go on and tell you what the bundle included, because it also included the psychological interactions with the family members there. But they had no survivors. We just used 2 years as a 2 to 2 years, 2 years to 2 years comparison. And what we found here was that actually this goes back to for about the previous 5 years with no survivors, but we started improving things. And let me tell you what happened here. We actually said, if it's so important to get the drug out and get it on board quickly, what we said here was like, let's get it prepared in the unit. We know it's a 1-year-old, so we'll get 0.1 of epi out, right, and prepare it. Or if it's a 9-year-old, we'll get 0.3 out, or whatever it might be. We'll have the right drug ready to go as we get there. And the time elements became dramatic here in terms of getting the numbers down, whereas they scooped and run and they gave it to them out in the ambulance or whatever they did. Now getting on scene right to intraosseous, and then finally, as you're preparing it ahead of time, you get on board right away. This is from the time that you arrived on scene here, which is not at the patient's side, but on scene. So it was pretty impressive, and this has gotten better since then. Now, I can't prove to you that it was how we ventilated the patient. I can't prove it's because of how we did that. We just did it on scene, or it's the epinephrine. These are all things that we're looking at. But this is the most important point, is that we are getting back, in this case, 33%. We're pushing 40% now versus no survivors. And we were working more cases than we were before, because before they might have just said this kid has, they're dead, and left them on the scene. Impressive stuff, and that's cool. So what I say, you want to finish here, or do you want to give them a little bit advance notice about what we're going to present at SCCM this year? Are we okay on time, Meg? If we got another 5 minutes here?
Yeah, you got time.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, then how about we use neuroprotective CPR as a more recent example? Not that the other examples weren't that recent, but this is hot off the press.
All right, well, good. And here it is. So if you're not aware of it, but what we've been doing is we were finding out when you do standard CPR, you're putting compression on the chest and you're sending a pressure wave up the arterial side, but you're also increasing pressure on the venous side. So obviously basic CPR works, it saves lives, but it only produces about 20%, 15 to 25% of your normal blood flow that you get through the brain, like your cerebral perfusion pressures a fifth of what you normally would do. What we ended up learning was that if you put this ITD thing in, because it does enhance flow back into the chest on the recoil phase, and then you're also doing something like with the Lucas device, or probably better yet with the active compression decompression device, which I think they got one here somewhere. But what we also found out is that if you gradually elevate the head over the next 3 or 4 minutes after priming the pump with this stuff, because it really increases flow dramatically, like we already knew that from that study that I showed you out of the Lancet before, that this improves neurological outcomes much better. Well, it turns out that if you gradually elevate the head later, and this is another device that they use, I think you can go out and buy these, and they're all, everything I'm going to tell you about is all FDA approved, by the way, which is, and I don't have any conflict of interest with these at all. I'm just do their work. So here we go. It turns out Johanna Moore here does our work in the laboratory, and she's going to present this at SAEM this year as well. I think we're going to show you what we found with non-shockable rhythms. So be looking for her if you're there. So in any event, this is the coolest thing. This is cerebral perfusion pressure. This is like normal values. Then you put the animal into cardiac arrest. These are animal models. And then you go along here and boom, boom, and then it sort of flattens out and does this thing here, right? Why does this go down, by the way, over 20 minutes? Why does your cerebral perfusion? Because what's happening is you're losing peripheral vascular tone is going away that you used to have, because there's no oxygen going out to those blood vessels, and you're starting to get a lot less tone out there, so you can't generate as good a pressure. If you look at the active compression decompression devices with the ITD, for example, that combination of those two things, interestingly enough, is that not only did it get better flows, we already knew it improved outcomes, but you get this, but it's more sustained. And that's what's kind of cool about this. But look what happens when we combine this thing where we put this on for about a few minutes, and then we start raising the head up, okay, gradually over another 2 minutes. We're restoring normal values is what we're getting in the laboratory. It's been really impressive what we're finding out. And in this model here, as we're comparing to human cadaver models, we've just been studying the hell out of this thing, and it's been really impressive. So we took it to the field, and that's what we're going to present to you if you're attending the SCCM. I think I'm on in the morning on April 19th. And this is the paper they rated. And what you're looking at here is a cumulative survival with favorable neurological outcomes by head-up CPR device placement in terms of the time from the 911 calls. This is from the time of the 911 call, less than 7 minutes, which is possible in some cases, less than 8 minutes. More probable, you're usually in these arenas right here. And this is being compared to, the question is, these are about 230 cases that we were examining here, okay, overall, compared to what? What we did is we went and got 5,000 published cases, okay, of cardiac arrest, and matched these guys up, okay, in a incredible 4-to-1. I think, Remley, if you match them up to 5-to-1, 6-to-1, do you get much more out of it than if you do a 4-to-1 matching on those?
No, so we're talking about case control and matching. There's a point of diminishing returns, and that point is generally around 4-to-1.
So that's how you guys come up with this thing where we should do 4-to-1 matching. So we're comparing them to like people who are, you made a good point. We looked back at these NIH studies that were done. And by the way, we've compared them now to more recent data. If anything, these are actually better outcomes than we're seeing more recent data in other things, like if any of you work with CARES or whatever else, and I think you're going to look at it for the ESO and see how they're doing there. But this is probably as good as you can get. So we purposely challenged ourselves by getting to be into those trials. You heard her say you had to demonstrate you're doing good CPR. Turns out they weren't always doing good CPR, but that's what you could optimally show. And they were recording it. So we had recordings of that, of everything. And we had all the data that completely matched up in terms of time of arrival, time CPR started, all that kind of stuff. And what you see here is that the only reason why these are not statistically significant probably is because they're just because of the purely numbers. Most of the people are showing up in this area here. And you can see here, I want to show you in a second, this is like almost like a 2-to-1, almost 3-to-1 better outcomes overall. And if you're down here, it's 4-to-5 better outcomes in terms of odds ratios. And we'll show you that in just a second. But the starring meaning that it's statistically significant, despite the fact this is just our first look-see. This is just a first look-see at these data. Okay. And that's our propensity match control, which she'll talk about in just a second. Okay. And then we have favorable neurological outcome here. And this is with non-shockable rhythms. And I think this is the most important thing we're going to present at SAM in a little while in May. And this is right along the thing. It's even better than the window of opportunity that you get with the AEDs. What's really impressive here is all along, this is really the AEDs for non-shockable rhythms in a sense, because 80% of your cases are non-shockable. That's why this is so important. We may get back a lot more lives. I mean, we're talking about odds ratios in the 4 to 5-fold thing. And I'm going to show you a spline curve here in just a second. But what I really want to show is that the earlier you get it on, the better off. And these systems that are down in this range here, they were doing something interesting. They were making a pit crew approach by having, like say, here's just 2 people carrying this thing in. They found it was better when a fire truck guys were doing it because they can get there quicker. But let's just say, hey, there's these 2 paramedics here. They can carry all that equipment in and get it in. But more importantly, it's like a pit crew. It's not just getting to the scene fast. It's like you open it up and it's all ready to go. You know, you put the patient on and boom, 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 you get this thing done. And it's really a basic life support function. So I think you are saying, giving you a glimpse in the future, this is going to be on fire trucks. It's going to be with, you know, I don't know, lifeguards. I think that's where we're going to see our bang for our buck there. Maybe too ready for prime time for the public to have yet, like AEDs. But, you know, you're going to see, and here's our spline curve showing favorable neurological outcomes and, you know, with this, and you can see these odds ratios are, you know, dramatic when you get out here. And these are all statistically significant here. 4 and 5 if you can get there within 7 or 8. The numbers were just too low up here to show anything, but it clearly was better all the way along until you get out to like 20 minutes or so. Remley, we put you on this because we wanted you and several other leading researchers and statisticians from the globe to validate how we're doing this. Can you tell them a little bit of what this propensity match controls is and what it does and why it works? So I don't want to be, you know, too patronizing to those of you who know what this is, but I want to make sure we're all sharing the same concepts there and how you guys did it and why you recommended it in this case of cardiac arrest.
All right, you know, I could talk statistics all day, but since we are in our last 3 minutes here, I'll be quick and simple. When we're talking about propensity match controls, first of all, we should think about, why do we randomize in a randomized control trial? And so obviously the answer is because we want to control for those things that we don't usually know about, right? All of the confounding variables, and make sure they're randomly assigned. But in the case of an observational study, we didn't get to choose who got the intervention. And so we use propensity scoring to create a control group that has the same distribution of characteristics as that intervention group. So it's like creating a mini RCT with observational data. And that's all it is matching on specific characteristics that we think could influence outcomes.
But in a sense that you're controlling for a lot of things here, you probably, I wonder if you're matching better in some respects, that you think there may be, in the case of cardiac arrest, I'm saying, again, I'm being provocative, that there is a possibility that we could actually be you know, controlling better under these circumstances, especially if you're doing a 4-to-1 ratio against the best of the best out there, right?
Absolutely. If you're being intentional about what you're matching on, you can you ensure that you control for it. Whereas with randomization, you're hoping that the randomization controls for it. And as you get larger, that's likely to happen. But in smaller randomized studies, you don't always get perfect randomization of characteristics.
Yeah. All right. So anyways, let's, I think you got to move on to other things yourself.
I do.
Yeah, when it comes down to this, is that again, our experience told us that there may be something wrong here. And are we going to say the statistics are right once again? But what I'm thinking here is this: is that one of the things that really my experience tells me is that when you've got patients that usually had what are the end-tidal CO2 usually during CPR? What? 15, 20, 25, maybe, that kind of thing. When we first started doing this, and this is just the asystole patients, we were getting the end-tidal CO2s up in over almost all the patients up over 32. And in fact, the max values were then eventually approaching around 51. We actually were improving flow because the end-tidal CO2s were telling us we were improving flows dramatically early on. And the other thing we're seeing is all these amazing numbers of anecdotes of people saying, I remember exactly what happened. And they actually repeated line for line things that they heard around them that was going on. They were waking up even though they were still in VF. And these are young, healthy people under these circumstances. So all of that is telling us that this is the real deal. It is neuroprotective, and that's it. Is there anything else we should be using, Remley, before you leave here that you think in the future?
Yeah, I'll leave you with one thing that's sort of emerging, and that is Bayesian statistics. So in prior days, we were limited and weren't able to do Bayesian statistics because of computer limitations. So this is a really mathematically intense operation. But in short, what it does is it lets us take into account what we've learned from prior studies. So in our traditional approach to research, frequentist approach, we're treating every trial or every study as a new thing. Whereas with Bayesian, we take into account those prior things that we've learned, combine it with the present study, and that gives us our new estimate. And so this is definitely up and coming and will probably be a lot more popular in future years as computers have caught up and we're able to do this.
All right, well, anyways, we've kind of overstayed our welcome here today. So in conclusion, as you say, on the road to what I call the Rothstein 20s, right? Return of spontaneous circulation, the dead shall be raised and will make life better for future iterations. I'm Paul Pepe and it's Remley Crowe, and we approve this message. So thank you very much, everybody.